Is our reality a quantum hologram? What if the truth about life after death lies waiting to be discovered in the basement of a haunted house? Are we connected to galactic civilization? I lie awake at night thinking about these things. I never miss an opportunity to ask bigger questions. We all know as we move into an uncertain future that humanity faces enormous challenges. Luckily for us, there's a lot of people working on solutions. With me here in the studio are two esteemed futurists, both approaching global solutions from different perspectives, yet united for the same cause. So tonight, we're going to sit down and face the 15 biggest challenges facing humanity, and if we're lucky, we might just have a solution for every one of them. I have Jerome Glenn, the founder of the Millennium Project and an esteemed futurist who has set up 50 nodes all around the world to study and report on how we can collectively solve global issues. And also with me is Elliott Maynard, PhD. Elliott is a futurist who takes a look at future issues by assuming that humanity is going to evolve to an almost quantum state, which would definitely give us a whole new approach to solving global issues. Elliott has a new book. Elliott, what's the name of your book?
Brave New Mind, Living in a Future Science World.
So if anybody can solve the world's problems, it's the three of us right here, right now. So Jerome, what's problem number one?
Problem number one, or challenge number one, is how can we achieve sustainable development for all within the framework of climate change, global climate change?
I believe that changing consciousness really needs to begin from the bottom up. Grassroots, in other words. And this can take place by public education and education of children from their earliest ability to learn, and especially education from the parents. And this way we're creating a positive legacy that will spread between cultures, and globally hopefully there will be sharing of the technology and the animal stock and plant stocks, so that this would begin to spread around the globe, especially if the seeds were planted at different strategic places.
I think that we need more people growing and less people eating meat. I think that we need less Monsanto and more grandma's garden. And I think that when we begin to reintroduce a more oxygen-rich supply into the environment, then that's going to help to curb and maybe even reverse global warming. So we have too many cows farting and not enough people growing their own food. And the food that we are growing is getting more and more contaminated by genetic manipulation to the point where it's less nutritious, and who knows what it's doing to the planet, and who knows what it's doing to the planet-wide species of edible foods. So I think that we need to really get back to basics, and that's going to alleviate a lot of the issues.
Well, I'd like to see a U.S.-China 10-year Apollo-like goal to reduce parts per million of CO2 equivalent in the atmosphere from 400 to 350 in 10 years. That would focus attention of the world on how to coordinate on climate change, because we have a lot of activities going on, and the ones that you're both suggesting are important to do. But a lot of times you've got to focus science and focus economics and focus politics. And I think the U.S. and China, as the world's largest polluters and the largest economies, have a moral responsibility and the capacity to focus this attention to achieve a reduction and a change in climate change. And the rest of the world can join in. But I think they should be the head of it, in the same way that we did land a man on the moon. And we thought that that was impossible when Kennedy said it. Many people were not sure you're going to land a man on the moon. Well, a lot of people think we can't get back to 350. Well, let's give it a try.
What's global challenge number two?
How can we provide enough water for everyone without conflict and war?
Well, first of all, we need to change our habits from water as an infinite resource, recognize it as a birthright and the critical resource that it is. We need to protect these new, vast underground reservoirs, because these reservoirs underneath some of these countries, especially in Africa, cross over national lines. And so when these reservoirs are drained, they take sometimes up to hundreds and thousands of years to recharge. So there are many ways to curb water use. We simply are very wasteful in too many ways in our so-called civilization, you know.
So I think that an approach to better water purification, more efficient use of water,
And conservation.
And conservation, that's what I was going to say next, is irrigation right now is extremely wasteful. We already have technologies that, like an aeroponics or an aeroponics garden where the water recycles through the garden, nothing evaporates, the only water being used is by the plant itself. And so you're growing twice as much food with 90% less water. So as we can cascade the technologies of purifying and the technologies of using water more efficiently to produce food, which is arguably the largest consumption of water, and we can do that on a global scale, we'll find that food production costs will actually go down over time, and the better use of water will be a very welcome benefit.
And I think that we should shift as much of our freshwater agriculture to saltwater agriculture as much and as possible wherever we can, and that we should produce meat without growing animals as much as possible, because that consumes so much water in the production of meat.
And that's a huge emerging technology.
Yes, sir.
Jerome, what's global challenge number 3?
How can we bring into balance population growth and resources?
This is one of the biggest elephants in the room that no one wants to recognize. We have the intelligence to encourage people to neuter their dogs and cats. In other words, intelligent population management. Unfortunately, we are still suffering. This is a matter of women's empowerment and women's leadership. And because of an inertia from the Industrial Revolution, women were expected to produce more children so that they could help around the farm or the factory, and then they were valued as essentially, in some countries, an extension of the man or breeding stock. Now, this is changing, and I think it's a very positive sign. One of the strange things that's happened is Italy has, among a few other countries, its population has started to shrink. When people begin to understand the freedom and the way a country's whole economy can change, when women are balanced out so that they have much more free time, the rest of the family can participate in raising the children, and the wisdom gets empowered from the grandparents. This is the best of both worlds. I think it's a win-win situation, and it's taken root surprisingly fast. I'm sure Jerome has some positive tags to put on this.
So I think that we don't have a global initiative to stabilize the population. Nobody is speaking from the global pulpit. None of the big countries are getting together. China had population controls in place that were nothing short of draconian. It didn't work. Elliott's right. There's a mentality, and it's actually true, that the more children you have, the more children you have to take care of you in your future. So there's an incentive to continue to have families that are bigger than yourself. We need to educate. We need to incentivize third world countries to not have that many children. You notice that in the evolving societies and in the first world, populations are stable and not growing nearly as fast as in the third world. And so there's still big reasons to have bigger families, and we need to look at that as being part of an overall solution to business and solution to how we approach it that makes this incentive not as attractive. And that needs to be a collective effort. And I think really just a United Nations decree, a country by country effort to educate the population, bring in condom use, practice birth control, come up with a fund for voluntary sterilization. I know that sounds draconian, but in some of these countries where people are just reproducing without any way of taking care of their families, we need to start taking some serious action. Not forced action, but we need to start taking serious action. And we need to look at this as a global issue, and we need to start coming up with some solutions that we could integrate. And it's really just a matter of speaking up and coming together that we have to do it.
This is a very sensitive issue, and I believe that the way you have presented this, the fact that we're sitting here having an intelligent conversation about this, is one of the most important things we could do to begin to allow other people to become part of the solution instead of the problem.
Well, one of the things that to keep in mind is that those species that have a lot of offsprings are in the most danger. And those species that are in the least danger have fewer offsprings. And that also works within a species, like as humanity. So those areas, like in the Palestinian area, we have a very high birth rate because it's very dangerous.
Yes.
And those areas that are very safe, like Westport, Connecticut, and very wealthy, have fewer. So one of the strategies is to make world successful, and you'll bring down the rate. Now, the world is becoming more successful, and the fertility rates are falling, even in Kenya and various places around the world. Not that fast, but they are all going down. As you point out, in some countries, Russia and Japan and others, are beginning to go down in population. So we've also got the problem of that going down like this, and that's a danger as well. We were going to be on living, I think, a lot longer than people think, which I think is going to be necessary, because the idea of having people live long, not only like in a wheelchair, but healthily living, because the idea of having a small number of people as the fertility rates go down, supporting all the social welfare nets for the health and welfare and retirement benefits of a large number financially will not work. Europe is already going through that strain, and the whole world will hit that strain. So it's going to be useful, actually, for people, in my judgment, to live a long time in a healthy way and make a living on internet and other ways that you don't have to require working in a coal mine anymore. So one part is make the world successful as much as possible, reduce the fertility rates naturally. And two, understand that people are going to live a lot longer than we think. So the demographics is not just simply the volume, it's what the volume is doing as well going into the future.
So Jerome, what's next?
Okay, challenge number 4 is how can genuine democracy emerge from authoritarian regimes?
My concern about genuine democracy is that it leads to authoritarian regimes. There was recently a study that the United States is no longer a democracy or even a republic, it's an oligarchy. And the fact that we still, even in the most advanced country on the planet, can't get past a certain level of corruption that brings this about. We have to evolve democracy before we can implement it. It looks great on paper, but the way it plays out, we have a lot of work to do.
Yes, we do. Yes, we do. And one of the things that I think may be happening is that new forms of governance are emerging slowly around the planet. And those new forms will self-organize and, in a sense, create new kinds of power beyond the conventional systems. So in a sense, you're creating democracy, to me, is also a responsiveness between the governed and the governors, whether those governors are governments or other kinds of rule systems, because there's all kinds of governance systems coming up. So I think that we'll also be looking at new forms of government, so we won't only be relied on the conventional nation-state government system.
Elliott?
I like to think that there should be some basic seeds of behavior, some basic guidelines, which should be planted in the earliest stages of education. Some of the ladies in third world countries have, when they've been freed from having to bear and care for all these children, have been the leaders of the ecological movements. So this is all changing. It's shifting very fast now, relatively speaking.
You know, it's almost that the more people evolve in such a way that they can harmoniously self-govern, the less government they need.
Right, that's right. Okay, challenge number 5. How can global foresight improve decision-making?
I think that first we need an infrastructure of decision-making that actually works. If you have gridlock, like within governments and then within multiple governments, if you have gridlock, you can have all the foresight in the world. The 50 nodes of the Millennium group knocking on these doors. Hey guys, this is happening, it's happening now. But in order for foresight to create decision-making, we have to have a better way of making decisions collectively.
Yes, and I've had a feeling there's one thing that lends stability. Oh, you were speaking earlier of Homeland Security, which has been beaten to death. I like to use the term sometimes, it's heartland security. Really, real security begins in achieving stability and peace in the ways we've already discussed, bringing women to the forefront because they have a great deal. Many societies in this world, and you would be able to maybe put a percentage on this, are matriarchal societies. Mm-hmm. We forget this. We're very provincial in America, and we don't realize it. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, one of the areas we suggest is each country should create their own State of the Future Index. So the country goes through a process of figuring out what is important about an improved future, and how do we measure that, and how's the index going, and what are the most important variables that are sensitive, so we can actually have a rational budget based upon what's important rather than what's just politically expedient. Another is that each president or prime minister's office should have a future strategy unit and participate with a national collective intelligence system so the country can think itself together into a better future. Okay, challenge number 6 is how can information, the convergence of information and communications technologies work for everyone?
This dovetails back into something you were discussing before. Words are far too slow. Although we are being bombarded with data constantly, and the flow and volume is speeding up. We're also becoming better data miners, and also the information cannot be contained the way it used to be. So with the cat out of the bag, again, it's creating a new game. And having, with people, ordinary people, having access to the information that's available through the internet and other communication media, they can look for the facts themselves. They don't need talking heads to tell them these things.
We're out of business.
So there's amazing changes taking place. It's taking place in unexpected and surprising and positive ways. I try to be a little bit of an incurable optimist.
So yeah, I think that as the methods of dispersal of information become less expensive, you know, tablets are down to where you can buy one now for $25, and I think the company making them is doing well. So as we get, companies like Google are putting the internet on balloons, as we come up with better ways to disperse the information, then the information itself takes on a life of its own in the lives of the people that have access to it. And so what we end up with is that problem becomes solved by its own propagation. So as we move to make information and the technology to achieve and even, or to get, and even more importantly, to use information available to more and more people, then those people collectively create positive solutions that come from that access. So as the root of it all is get the information to the people, get the technology to the people, make sure there's not a person on the planet that can't log on to the internet, make sure there's not a child that can't read. And once that's done, it changes the entire face of humanity, and the information itself and the way it's aggregated and managed changes with it.
Very good. And one of the areas, a small little area I would add into that, is for those areas that don't have that much access, and those areas that are poorer in the world, that have lost the best and brightest in many cases, the classic brain drain problem, can be addressed to some degree by doing what we do with computer dating systems. Take those hotshot brains overseas and connect them to the development process back home, because after all, we don't do everything in the same room all the same time we work together, right? So do the same thing on a global basis so that you can actually hook up these people. And Montenegro, Cape Verde, and some other countries are beginning to actually do this sort of a thing, called telenations.
And I believe Jerome brought up a very important point. He mentioned the value of the performing arts as a vehicle to create almost instant cultural diplomacy. And I would cite it as an example the Olympics, the Winter Olympics in Russia. Despite the fact propaganda was thrown, there was so much magic. And this is probably one of the times that people of all nations come together, those that have access to television. And I think it's this is a kind of transformation we have all the technology for.
Good.
So art as a conveyor of information that speaks
the
across,
arts,
it breaks all
performing
cultural
arts, and science,
linguistic lines.
and music.
Yep.
It's universal.
Challenge number 7 is how can the power of the market help reduce the gap between the rich and the poor?
This is probably something that requires a very, very deep change in the area that John Hagelin has spoken about, something called indefensible defense technology. That's not quite the word. But essentially, this uses a system that was demonstrated 3,000 years ago in India, where a group, apparently a very large group of some 50,000 Tibetan monks, got together with one of the masters, and they started to chant together, and they created a group consciousness. This was the seed of this indefensible defense technology. And what it does is go to the very root, below all of the weapons of mass destruction, and can release the tensions, and it's in a sense a conflict resolution tool. Now, this has already been statistically proven in a number of countries. Several countries, Ecuador and others, have special military units that sit and practice this. They use a transcendental meditation technique approach to it. But what it is coherent consciousness. And I heard you earlier mention the word coherence. Coherence, coherence, coherence is probably, if we can achieve this, either through, there are many different ways to achieve it, but when we do, we're going to have a basis for peace, world peace, and a whole new future, I believe.
You know, that's really interesting that you actually bring that element into this particular conversation, because distilled down what you said, I think it boils down to that we have to demand that from our markets. We are, the masses are the people driving the market, but the masses are not in control of the market. The markets, almost all markets, are still being controlled by a select few that have questionable, at the very least, very greedy devices in which they're using. Now, sooner or later, people have to stand up and say no, and that's happening. We have to demand ethics from our corporations. We have to demand ethics from ourselves. And so, as Elliott said, it is a fundamental collective shift in consciousness that will bring together, it's the macrocosm and the microcosm. Fix the microcosm, the macrocosm adjusts itself. As people collectively refine their ethics, as people collectively refine what they expect in the workplace and what they expect from the companies that are given the societal responsibility of being a company. A company should take care of the people that work for it. A company should be responsible to global ethics and global requirements and global needs. Once we actually are holding our corporations and our wealthy accountable for doing things that are beneficial for the collective, then that is when the market is driving the appropriate change. And as we ourselves start to have these conversations, I see that shift happening. And again, it starts with the individual, and it bubbles up into corporate mentalities, it bubbles up into governmental mentalities, it bubbles up into global mentalities.
Very good. You'll be pleased to know that we did a study just after the 2008 crisis of the elements of the next economy. And we had elements like non-ownership. The internet is non-owned, so to speak, but it's a means of production around the world. But it's not state-owned, it's not privately owned, it's non-ownership. Big deal. And out of all of these elements, I think 30 or some odd elements we assessed, the one that was rated the highest actually was getting ethics into the whole conversation of economics. And through the universities, through the boardrooms, through the evaluations, ethics was rated number one. Another one of the areas of bridging the gap between the rich and the poor is the idea of using that 40% analogy, not analogy, but 40% of humanity is surrounded by 40% of humanity. It's not a zero-sum game. so that we're not teaching our children yet to understand themselves. Who am I? What is my interest? What are my passions? How do I find markets for those? What we're teaching people now is what are your passions and how do you go get a job for that? Right? Well, we're knowing that there's not that many jobs. The efficiencies and the rapid automations, the integrations of technologies, the artificial intelligence, the driverless cars, the 3D printing, I mean, you can go on and on and on. And people say, well, yeah, didn't we have this problem before when we went from agriculture, the industrial, and from industrial? You say, yeah, but this is so much more faster than before. And the integration is so the order of magnitude is different. But what opens up is the idea that anybody can be a multinational corporation. Anybody can reach out to the whole world, but we're not teaching people to know who they are and how to find what's interesting to them. And all of us are not just one thing. We're not just an industrial engineer. We might be a juggler. We might be a television producer. We might be all kinds of different things. So why not find markets? It's a whole other paradigm of reducing the rich-poor gap. Because if you're making a living about what you love, then maybe you don't care so much about what the neighbor is making.
You know what I like about the answers that we just got to that particular question is that it very clearly comes from 3 different streams of thinking, but it all managed to converge on one very important factor, and that is that we have to evolve that ethical standard and increase the education and evolve as human beings. And as we do, then the whole problem and challenge comes along, the solution comes along with the evolution.
Right. Challenge number 8. How can we address the rapid changing health disease situation in new kinds of diseases, increasing immune organisms, and returning kinds of diseases such as dengue fever and cholera and so forth?
I think that we're dealing with a global health organization that in all of its manifestations is deeply flawed. Mm-hmm. We're dealing with a system in the Western world, America especially, where we are bred to be sick. We're fed food that is making us sick. It's covered with pesticides. It's grown by Monsanto. These genetic alterations that we're making to the food supply. Mm-hmm. I've read both sides of the argument. I think that until the information's in, it shouldn't be a part of people's daily diet. I think that we need to understand the basis of health. We were born to be healthy. And the diabetic situation, I have type 2 diabetes. I got it because I was being fed the same food as everybody else, and I was eating at Jack in the Box and McDonald's all the time, right? And I paid a price. And so people need to understand, and it plays back into the whole idea of sustainability, is that when we get back to taking better care of ourselves, then our immune systems play up. They get better and better. These diseases take less and less of a toll. And collectively, I know it doesn't solve the whole issue, but collectively, self-awareness about health, not continuing to listen to a food supply system that is designed to feed you bad food, let you breathe bad air, make you sick, make all kinds of money off you when you get cancer, and then take everything that you worked for your entire life to keep you alive for the last 6 months, and then it's over. So we've got a whole system that's been designed to bring you in, use you up, and spit you out, and health and nutrition are a huge part of it. And one of the most co-opted aspects of what I consider to be a natural human right, the right to eat good food, the right to eat pure food, is being taken away. And so that's a great place to start. It's not going to spawn new vaccines, but it's going to spawn a lot less people who need them.
That's right.
Well, this is an area that I've been researching and actually have personally experienced. Medicine, they're actually selling these new ailments and these new, if you look at these new drugs, there are 2 pages of disclaimers, and this commercial goes on. When you see it, you could even suffer death and all of these horrible things, and I'm going, something's wrong with this picture. They're spending all this money to advertise this drug, which will take care of this problem, which is probably could be corrected by proper nutrition. And some of the other ancient and time-honored medical protocols that have been in effect for thousands of years, herbal, acupuncture, acupressure, and just balancing out a person's system through what we would call primitive but more intuitive methods. In other words, people have gotten away from taking care of themselves, from caring for themselves. And then this is reflected in their families and in the dysfunctional society. So what Ron was saying was that we need to get back to basics. And when you have really good food that's grown in proper surroundings, much of the disease, if not most of it or all of it, will eventually go away, because people, their temperament will be better, their families will be better, it'll alleviate crime and a lot of other things that are caused by nutritional imbalances, among other things. And so I think we're making great progress in the area, in the more civilized areas of the world. This is coming to the other third world countries too.
So I think we put a dent in it, but I know Jerome is probably going to say, look, you can eat all the carrots you want. It's not going to keep you from getting Ebola.
Well, I think we still should eat a lot of carrots, and I do. My eating behaviors changed rather drastically in the last few years, so I'm with you on that. But you're right. There are certain things, like with synthetic biology and terrorism, you can see some biological problems, and also with the compressing of human beings into new areas where they weren't other humans, you get these diseases transfers from other animals into us. So there's a possibility of all new kinds of things popping up, and which are. One of the things we're learning with the AIDS research is a lot about the immune system. We may learn enough about the immune system that we might be able to create a universal vaccine. This can't last for very long because it'll kill you. The idea is, how do you bring up the immune system very hard and very fast, no matter what the heck the agent is? And then that knocks it out, so the area, it runs its course. So the idea is, imagine that this material that can increase your immune system, treat it like a fire extinguisher. You don't know where the fire is going to happen, but you got a fire extinguisher somewhere just in case. So let's say if Ebola goes airborne or some bizarre change like that, you want to isolate that area with immune really fast. And you can do this by setting up those kind of things. So that's a different kind of paradigm for addressing some of the new diseases. Global challenge number 9 is, how can we increase our intelligence and wisdom enough to address all these global challenges?
When people come to the realization that by forming coherence, essentially it's the same as collimated light. When you have this kind of situation and straighten the fibers out, you have fiber optic cables which can transmit light. And information will go the same way. This has been researched very intensively by people like Stanislav Grof and some of the people who are the original consciousness researchers. But it has been proven that when people become more coherent, in other words, more in consensus, as certain cultures do, like the Hopis or the Navajos, but especially the Hopis, you have a healthier society, you have stability, you have less reason to have conflict with your neighbors, and instead engage in meaningful trade and exchanges.
People who watch this show know that that I consider the 2 biggest questions facing humanity to be, are we alone in the universe, and is there life after death? And this plays into this, because as we begin to evolve into scientific understandings that answer these questions, then once those get cemented into society as knowledge, not conjecture, nobody debates gravity or blue sky. If we didn't debate that consciousness survives death, if we didn't debate that we were not alone in the universe, but it was part of our collective consciousness, then our desire to absorb information and our desire to absorb enriching types of information would change. And the reason it would change is because we would understand that we're not finite beings, that we're living in a situation in a world here that is not forever, and that we do go on. And so as science evolves to provide more concrete answers about the nature of our own existence, then the way that we seek information, the nature of the information that we seek, and what we do with that information and the way we relate to each other we'll take a quantum leap. And so I think that as we begin to answer fundamental questions about existence, as we get closer, we get better theories, we get definitive answers. It doesn't matter. As we evolve down that path, then the whole way that we acquire, treat, use information changes just as a result. So I think evolution in science and evolution in understanding of existence will bring about the desire to integrate information in new and different ways.
And what I would add to that is I'd like to have every department of education in the world or ministry of education in the world include in their mandate increasing intelligence as an objective of education. We've got increased knowledge, socialization, and that's it. And Venezuela for a couple of years had it as an objective. That didn't last very long. But if a country decides that increasing intelligence is a national objective of education, and all of a sudden teachers had to say, well, how do you increase intelligence? Because we were all brought up as children saying the brain doesn't change. We now know that's not true. You can get smarter, you can get more intelligent, so okay, why aren't we changing our education system to do that? And then the other thing I would add in there is make collective intelligence systems as normal as email in the future. That you should have your own collective intelligence. What's the most important thing to you? What are the best people to access? What are the best decision-making systems for you? What are the best ways of visually displaying for different people, different things? But then also national collective intelligence system and the world collective intelligence system, so we can think ourselves together. Challenge number 10. How can we come up with and share knowledge of what we know about conflict resolution, conflict prevention, and how to create a more peaceful society?
One of the most important things is for everyone to come into this forum with their own viewpoints, but to settle on some basic common grounds. Once you have the common grounds, the other things can be worked out. And I've seen this again and again in dealing with other cultures and other parts of the world. They sit down together and you're having whatever tea or beer or whatever and sharing food, breaking bread, and these people say, yeah, we could sit down and solve all the problems we have. It's no problem. We could solve it. It's the damn government policies. I've heard this again and again. So we have this like dilemma of the human condition, and of course you have culture and religious values coming in and all of the other things. But these got overcome when we begin to have that kind of, there's a joy in this consensus that can be caught. It's a viral thing. It's a joy, I think it's a joy of freedom, or the promise of freedom. I suspect that America was founded on this thing, even though the founding fathers apparently really had knocked down, drag out drinking bouts and fights and everything else that we don't always hear about. They managed to get on with the program and become part of the solution. Mm-hmm. And I like to think of creating not just, if I have 3 little guidelines that I think should be planted in the school children's and in our cultures, in our business cultures too. That's try to do a good deed every day for something nice for someone. That's an old Boy Scout thing. Make the place a little better than you found it, and try to create some win-win situations. Now, if you start creating win-win situations in business, then you can move to the win-win-win, where you have more business partners and create a triple. But in the quantum realm, you can go as far as creating win to the X power. Now, that's probably never approached. It's not possible to hit 100%, but my God, if you could hit 50% or 10%, what a different world it would be. Mm-hmm. Those simple truths, and so basic, we could just get people to start thinking in those terms.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that there's tried and true methods for conflict resolution that we know work. Mm-hmm. The problem that we have is that there's nobody enforcing that. We don't have a strong enough UN to say, and get the rest of the world to collectively sign on to this. Okay, we're going to implement a global problem-solving infrastructure. let's, on a worldwide basis and a worldwide consensus, get this Palestinian-Israeli issue worked out once and for all. Let's implement the infrastructure to address these issues on a global scale, and let's do it in such a way that we are using compassionate, proven techniques. It's not about strength anymore. It's about respecting the people around you enough to understand that everybody has to win. And it's about understanding that everybody can win. There's so much mentality that still prevails, saying, I cannot gain unless I take something from you. And until we it falls back into reforming capitalism and reforming business, just like Elliott said and we've talked about. So many of these solutions dovetail into each other, certainly. But I think that conflict resolution needs to be something that's handled on a global scale, and that we as a global family need to come together to people that are having these conflicts, and we need to collectively work it out. We need to get involved in these conflicts. We need to have a body that does that. And I'm not saying that we need to get involved in forced solutions on people who are having conflicts. I'm saying that we need to get involved enough that we build a set of protocols that say, here's the conflict, here's the solution. Compromise absolutely must be made. That compromise will consist of this formula. And once we've done this enough times, we're going to be able to solve virtually every conflict that doesn't boil down to if this conflict isn't resolved, one person's going to live, one person's going to die. Those kind of conflicts that get a lot more challenging. But conflicts like what's happening in Israel, those conflicts I do not believe are insurmountable. We just need a more global effort towards resolving them.
United Nations was created originally in 1945 to essentially do that between nation states. And there was only one nation-state to nation-state war last year, North Sudan, South Sudan. All the rest of those, the Syrias, etc., are internal. So as we have drastically reduced nation-state wars, in fact, some people even say that's a dying phenomenon.
Thing of the past, yeah.
But what has started to increase is the internal. Now, the UN was not designed for that because we have this thing called sovereignty. Right? So at what point does the horror within, which is what you're pointing out, become so bad that the collective intelligence and the collective activity of the UN or some international body, when does that happen? The United States has not had the conversation among the American people. I, as you know, used to work with some UN university and other people, and I was one time an observer in a meeting, and they didn't know I was American in the thing. And they said, well, no, what are we going to do about the Americans on this? Oh, my God. The Americans are often seen as the outlier on a lot of things. So since we are so large and so powerful, we have a special responsibility to work with the UN on exactly what you're talking about, which is not being done. There's so much hostility toward the UN. People often confuse the UN with just the General Assembly. There's the World Health Organization. If we didn't have the World Health Organization, SARS would have closed down the world economy. Canada was closed down for what, 3 days? No trade. If we didn't have the world standard with the World Health Organization, we would have knocked out world trade easily for a month. You knock out world trade for a month, you've got a pretty serious economic problem on your hands, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So we as an American people, because usually I talk globally, but here America's got to grow up. How are we going to collaborate on this as well? The other thing I would add in there is that we're in the process of putting together what we call a peace chart. Peace chart has 3 sections. 1, conflict resolution, conflict prevention, and how do you build a peaceful society. What are all the strategies for each one? Where do they work? Where they didn't work? And why? When we get enough of that done, we'll probably throw it out on our system and a wiki and so that then have the whole world argue it through so that we can actually build it together. Because everybody's got, well, this is going to work. Yeah, but not always. And somebody, well, this is going to work. No, not always. Well, let's put it all together, folks, and collectively get our wisdom together and then go, what you're talking about is then what are the implementation systems to get this done? Because the internal, dealing with sovereignty, is a big issue now, not the nation state. That's more or less done. Not over, but more or less done. Challenge number 11. How can the changing role of women improve the human condition?
It really does boil down to the yin-yang, the female-male energy that is prevalent on the planet. And you know, you talk to the astrologers and they all say that recently we had a shift where the female energy is becoming more prevalent, and you poo-poo that at first, but then you see the rise in female politicians, the rise in females in positions. And it's hard to argue that the female energy is the gentler half of the human race. And so as women get more and more prevalent positions, then I believe that it really facilitates a shift towards a kinder, gentler way of interacting with each other. And I see that that's actually happening. It's the balance is shifting to the point where that opportunity is being realized.
I have a conviction somewhere deeply buried in my mind that probably the great majority of male leaders in history have had a very intelligent, wise, and powerful woman or women behind them or working with them. And there's a funny anecdote about this, that Westerners look at the Japanese male, you know, the female is subjugated, all of this. Well, my previous wife was Japanese, and so she told me a funny story one day. We were walking down in some very rough areas in Arizona, and she said the reason that the woman has the man, she walks behind the man, is that he scares the snakes up that way. So there are two sides to every story that we have to look at.
Very good. Well, one of the things I would add is that there's a largest war in the world is not internal to countries or transborders, it is men killing women. If you add that up, the statistics, in the United Nations we define war as 1,000 or more deaths a year. Clearly there's more than 1,000 deaths a year. And this we see around the world, and it's cross cultures, it's cross incomes, it's cross ages, it's a terrible war going on now. There's a lot of things to be said about that. One of the things, so I'll try not to say the obvious things, one of the things not that obvious I think is important, is taking a chapter out of deterrence. In martial arts, you deter by a certain awareness that you're able to take care of the situation, so you don't necessarily have to hit somebody, right? So what happens, and the same thing with the arms race. You have the rockets, not because you're going to use them, but because, you know, you're deterring. Now, imagine now in schools across the world, they all have physical education. Now, you can teach volleyball, nice team spirit, et cetera, and so forth. You can teach baseball. Why not also teach martial arts? It's good exercise.
It's wonderful.
It's good exercise. It's good discipline. It's all that sort of stuff. So when a woman gets up to the age where they might get raped or might be attacked, they might be a 3-belt martial art master. Now, there's not too many men in the world that will attack a 3-belt black martial art master. Now, we've got 60,000, a couple of years ago, 60,000 women enrolled in this in schools in Italy. With the martial arts teams, and we begin to do conversations. So we hope that spreads enough, and then maybe in 5 years we can come back and look, or 10 years, take a look. Did the violence go down more in this area versus the rest of Italy? My hunch is it will. And then some people counter this and say, well, wait a minute, then the men are going to learn it too. I said, yeah. How many martial art masters have you met that are idiots who would attack a woman anyway? None. No. None. So I would like to see martial, I don't care if taekwondo, jiu-jitsu, I don't care. But put it in the different education systems across the world, and I think that would help address this one issue, which is a major issue of the largest war on the planet. 12 is, how can organized crime be reduced from becoming increasingly more sophisticated and effective?
You need to find creative ways to make these people realize that they can be more, they can have more profit and more self-fulfilling concept of themselves and the world by becoming, again, part of the solution. This kind of thing usually becomes practical to make this happen in very small steps. And you've mentioned, I think, 2 or 3 examples of the crime rates diminishing in certain areas when major changes were made. And these changes can be things all the way from what you're seeing on television to the nutrition of a country, or other things that, and again, they can be quieted down. And once you quiet things down, people will talk to each other and start to trade instead of fight. It takes a lot of energy to fight.
We have 2 major types of organized crime. And one of the types of organized crime could be solved by legalizing the crime. The other type of organized crime is a lot more difficult to stamp out. So let me give you a couple of examples. why is, importing pot from Mexico, which is causing more people to die in the streets of Mexico City than died in the Iraq War, we've already taken a big step towards that. We're legalizing marijuana, we're growing it in warehouses, we're taxing it. Okay, that's a pretty easy problem to solve because the marijuana could be argued as a fairly victimless crime, so you make it legal. You wipe out the need for organized crime because it's not a crime anymore, it's a business. And organized crime operates as a business anyway, they're just doing things that are illegal. So one way to stem organized crime is to decide which of these crimes really should be legal and taxed. But then we run into way more difficult challenges, and human trafficking is one. You can't legalize human trafficking, so what do you do about that? People that are patronizing these types of industries need to be punished more. You don't have to send somebody to jail because they hired a human trafficked girl off of Craigslist, but they can be socially embarrassed. There can be risk involved. And I think that when people realize it needs to be made, there needs to be a social stigma attached to supporting these groups. You can't support a group that is enslaving human beings by buying the products or by buying the bricks that were built by slaves in a foreign country. There needs to be a stigma attached through the collective understanding that when you do that, you're no better than the people that made it possible for you to do. And so people need to understand the repercussions of supporting organized crime. So education, legalizing the stuff that's not causing any harm anyway, and taking the organized crime elements that can't be legalized for obvious reasons.
And not glorifying organized crime like
sure.
Look at the television, look at the the rave reviews, these gory,
I mean, there's a huge ugliness, and
crime-filled.
human trafficking is one of my pet subjects that I'm just constantly being made aware of and learning more and more about. And we're not talking about things that are happening in foreign countries. We're talking about people, women especially, being smuggled over to America and forced by threat and financial deprivation to basically work as hookers and everything else. And people think that that's a victimless crime, but it's not. So we need to identify organized crime, stigmatize the labor of organized crime, and what we can't combat that way, we need to look at, should it just be legalized, and then it's no longer organized crime. So that's two approaches, I think, to the two different faces.
Organized crime, if you take all the military budgets of the world, add them up, it's about $1.5, $1.6 trillion. Organized crime, by our estimate, is at least $3 trillion. So think of the infrastructure of all the military in the world and double it. So the scale is tremendously large. And I think that's fine on legalizing exactly what you said, but then, like any business, they lose one line, they create a new line. I think one of the new lines we've got to worry about is buying and selling decisions politically around the world like we buy and sell heroin. The World Bank figures are somewhere around $1.5 or $1.6 trillion paid out in bribes a year. That's a hell of a lot of decisions you're buying, all right?
Right.
Now, what we need is a global strategy that works through the money system. You want to be able to, without going into great detail, people can read it in the State of the Future, but you want to have a system that can track the largest criminal systems, and then we do everything we're normally doing already. But then where the collaboration is we go from the top down, go from number one and slowly go down. And it's a long, complex thing of how we do that. But then we have a collaboration on this, I think we can go a long way. Because right now everybody's trying to do everything, and they do it in these little silos. There's not this comprehensive approach. And there is some hope in the thing, is there's about 8 countries that have signed off essentially on a global strategy. So that conversation is in process. The Interpol started its first global strategy place in Singapore. So the issue of organized crime has been brought up on the top, higher up in the agenda than it was some years ago. People were suddenly waking up that this is a global issue. We've got to handle it globally.
Well, there's one last issue of organized crime, and Afghanistan is the second example. Mena, Arkansas was the first example. If you know about that, the CIA was flying aircraft, C-130s, full of cocaine and landing in Bill Clinton's state and distributing it to the streets of America. And you might say, well, what does that have to do with now? Well, now we have Afghanistan and the world's 2,500% increase in the output of heroin since the United States went in. And if you don't think that elements of our government, especially CIA, who is known and documented to support its black projects through running drugs, at the same time the heroin has just exploded in Afghanistan, Heroin addiction in countries like Iran and Russia have exponentially grown, even in the US, but more in, coincidentally, our enemies. And so what we see is we see corruption at the highest levels of government. So that is an additional challenge that you have Interpol working on it. Well, Interpol knows who's moving the heroin out of Afghanistan. Interpol knows what's happening with that money. And so, you know, people will say, we went into Afghanistan to control the heroin, and people would say that's preposterous. But, you know, I'm not much of a conspiracy theory person. Well, opinions vary. But it's pretty obvious to anybody that reads between the lines and watches the statistics of what's happening that a lot of organized crime, world financial institutions, and governments are all unfortunately one and the same.
Challenge number 13, how can we have enough energy at the same time that is safe and affordable energy for the world?
There are more new systems for clean energy, and companies already formed with bringing these technologies up into industrial scale, into commercial scale. We have new ways of storing intermittent energy, meaning wind power and solar power. This has always been a problem. And these are coming together, and companies are beginning to use 2 or 3 of these new technologies. And it's happening a lot in Europe, it's happening in the United States, and I have a lot of recent information written on the book, and it's really surprising and remarkable. And unfortunately, this is not the sort of thing you hear on the news.
Well, one of the things that created the current collective intelligence system we have, the Global Future System, actually came out of a meeting on the future of energy, the Foundation for the Future. And it had about 3 answers. And one of the answers was, there's so much going on, and advances are going on all over the place, but people don't know simultaneously. So we need a collective intelligence system available to the world. So if you say, I want to build a house tomorrow, I want to know the state of the art on what I can get for my house on solar energy or on storage or whatever system. Because right now people are usually 5, 10 or more years behind in what their decisions are making. So that's one of the big areas right there. Is just get a good collective intelligence system on energy available to the world. So it's up to date, what's the latest research, what's available to actually purchase, who's got them, and if there's difference of opinions on them, like any other collective intelligence system, you have them. The pros, the cons, the costs, the effects, and have them there.
So I think to add to that, one of the biggest challenges that we're facing in energy is the fact that the powers that be in the energy business want to remain the powers that be in the energy business. If there is a technology for a free energy, if 0 point is sitting someplace in a lab waiting to be unleashed, if the existing infrastructure of energy distribution has its way, that technology won't be introduced to humanity until we've used the last drop of oil. So we're dealing with a situation where technology is moving exponentially at light speed. You know, there's 1,000 watts of energy in a square yard of solar power as the sun hits, and getting that efficiently translated is getting easier and easier. The problem is not the technology, the problem is not getting it to the masses, the problem is getting past the people who are making money off the existing energy infrastructure to allow this information technology, products, goods, and services to flow freely.
We know that Volkswagen has a 45 mile an hour and a 75 miles per gallon car. It's my understanding they introduced a 300 mile per gallon car into the US, and the US powers that be refused to accept it. Now, yes, it would shake things up, but look what Tesla has done for the whole auto industry. Look at the changes that have resulted from these other guys saying, whoa, we better get our act together. And it's happened again and again and again through all the different car companies.
Well, Tesla's succeeded in getting his technology into the mainstream because you still have to plug it in to the same meter that the power that the traditional infrastructure is still making money off of.
Challenge 14 is how can science and technology be accelerated for the benefit of humanity?
This is where I think we have to begin to change our concept of how we approach problems and work in this kind of quantum field environment, which some of the initial researchers used to call the whispering pond. Because what happens in a real think tank, you create kind of a coherent field. It's like the 100th monkey phenomenon or the invincible defense technology techniques. These things have been proven and they've been witnessed and, you know, researched. So somehow consensus, coherence, those are kind of key words. We used to use the term resonance in the early days of conflict resolution and conflict prevention. It's important to have this resonating basic consensus between parties, because then you have a foundation to build upon for peace, for future projects, anything.
I think that the real question isn't how do we accelerate science for the benefit of everybody. I think it's how do we share in the existing acceleration of science for the benefit of everybody. The current research and development pipeline is generally supported by militaries and governments, unless it's pharmaceutical companies that can, you know, they've got their own agenda too. But what happens is that the innovations are put into first top secret things, and it takes years for that technology to filter down to the public. It's not accelerating science. Science is accelerating exponentially. I don't know if we could sustain faster acceleration because we have to be able to keep up with it. It's not that it's not accelerating, it's that the distribution of scientific knowledge is controlled. It starts with governments and corporations, and it is used up by these same institutions. By the time it gets to the people where your average Joe could go and use this new quantum field to power his house, it's already been gobbled up and assimilated into the existing establishment.
Yeah, well, the second part of that question was for the benefit. So it's not just accelerating, but for the benefit is a key question. Now, one of the issues within that is this whole business about regulation, because you have you have, in a sense, two polar views, and obviously a lot of gradations between the two polar views. One is that you've got to regulate it because some of these things are so terrible, potentially wrong handled, that you've got to have global regulation. And then on the other extreme, they're saying, yeah, but if you regulate it, the people who are regulating it, they can't keep track of all this change. They don't know what the hell they're doing. They're way behind. They'll never be able to do it. And you'll drive it underground. You'll lose peer review. You lose the quality thing. And it's more dangerous anyway. These other people say, no, you can't just let it go. So it goes back and forth. Now, one of the third point between these two is take everything we know, which goes back to your business about the information access, and make it accessible so that people can see what the heck's going on as rapidly as possible. Now, we've actually talked about this to some of the corporations in advanced science. And you'd think that they would say, no, we're going to hide behind it. A lot of these people want to make their cases. And also, it's free market research for them as well. So there is a potential for actually creating such a system. So it wouldn't be like a world science technology organization, but not like a UNESCO, not like a bureaucracy, but a cyber system that everybody's got access to.
This has been done in the past by many of the scientists that I have worked with on things like free energy and similar scientific breakthroughs that they met tremendous resistance, again, fear of change and just, it's almost a knee-jerk reaction. So if you can find a way to feed it gently into that system, the whole thing begins to be transformed and people embrace it, and then there's no more problem. The original problem dissolves. And I think this can happen. This can happen in this gentle way. Maybe this is the new pattern for what this re-evolution will take place. It doesn't have to be a clash of armies.
Challenge number 15, how can global ethics be considered and integrated into decision making?
If you really distill it down and you say, okay, what is behind a decision? And then you're able to dissect that decision and you're able to see all the moving parts, you'll see that even the most complex decisions made by the biggest groups of people still boil down to the underlying ethical structure of the individuals involved and their collective ethical structure as they come together to make a decision. So improving ethics, evolving ethics, defining ethics, and creating this understanding of how important ethics are, it changes the way that we make decisions. And it's really interesting that, again, this all distills down to really one or two key issues. How do we solve all of the world's problems? First, we refine our own individual selves. And as we do that, it bubbles up into our institutions. We can say, well, we have to reform the institutions, eat the rich. No, start with yourself. Your companies will evolve.
And
your
this is what should be taught
evolve.
at the earliest levels of school.
This is what should be taught.
It should be taught to the parents so they can understand what the children are learning, and it would be a greatly different world.
An understanding of it. And you can't teach a child who's growing up in this world ethics and say, okay, ethics are a huge part of how we are supposed to interact with each other. And then the first thing he does is take a trip down to Tijuana and have to give a cop all his money to get through a fake roadblock. Ethics has to, it's going to take us a couple generations just to instill ethics. And then it has to be widespread and widely accepted. And the people, countries, institutions, and organizations that don't embrace, again, a global set of ethics are going to be outcasts in the global community. Solving humanity's global issues really boils down to the philosophical argument and the philosophical question of what is this place, why are we here, and what are the rules that make the entire universe tick? Because we can say we have to refine ethics, but if there's certain elements of our nature that are unrefinable, then what do we do?
That can be changed. And I believe that I have this deep-seated idea that progress and real commitment in ethics is addicting. Those 4 questions you mentioned, if those were instilled in children and they started thinking about these things from the youngest levels all the way through lifelong learning, again, I think people would start to realize that they can be part of solutions. They can achieve success. And once people start to get a sniff of that kind of a feeling of accomplishing even a small positive thing in the world with themselves or with others, it can go viral.
Doing good and making a positive change in the world is addicting, but for every positive change that gets out there, for every several, then there's one person who goes out and tries to make a positive change. He's not well received. He doesn't get the recognition that he thinks he deserves, so he gets pissed and blows up a bus.
If we're going to survive, the good will have to override the negative.
Jerome, you've heard 2 sides of your question.
Yeah. Well, I'd add to that there are several studies on global ethics. So it would be good for people to say, well, take a look at them. What are they? A lot's been done already. And we also did a study on the future of ethics. Like, for example, is it ethical for me to clone? Do I have a right to clone myself, yes or no? So there's all kinds of thorny questions coming up that don't necessarily lend themselves to the age of wisdom, necessarily, because some are difficult to go through. But there is studies I mentioned before. UNESCO went through a whole bunch of philosophies and religions and say, what are the common points? That exists. They also did this one on various ethical dilemmas with the Global Institute of Ethics, or whatever it's called, another one, boom. And then we did one on the future of ethics. Those things can be looked at. At the same time, independent of studies is a global participatory ethics system called the International Organization of Standards. Anybody can say, this is the right way to scratch your nose, or this is the right way to build a building, or this is the right way to fire somebody, whatever it happens to be. What is the ethical way to do these things? And if enough people start to sign on, it becomes a standard and used. There are now thousands of standards, unbeknownst to many in the United States, don't know this. But there is a global system in process, participatory process, very democratic in the sense of, buy in or you're not buy in, that's your choice. And that's evolving a global ethical systems right underneath our nose.
Now that is something to give the human race hope for. I mean, those people still remain optimistic, because that means you can make a difference. If one person is optimistic, I can make a difference.
I think that the challenges facing humanity just all really do boil down to a few core things, and I think that what you said about the establishment of global ethics on a practical manner. It was so easy for us, it's very interesting, it was so easy for both of us to approach the ethical situation and the ethical question from a philosophical manner, from a deep questioning manner, from a looking at things in a very non-physical way. And the realization and the understanding that there are tangible, concrete steps being taken and being accepted, more importantly, to instill global ethics is a huge plus. And it's a physical manifestation of the philosophical things that we ponder. So the show's all about bigger questions. And did we solve all the world's problems? Jerome, thank you.
Thank you.
Elliott, thank you very much.
Thank you.